There are few things more destructive than fire, and one needs to look no further than the current fire problem in the US to see that. In fact, David Diamantes, who's an author of the book Principles of Fire Prevention, highlights this growing problem by stating that our national fire record is or has historically been one of the worst in the Western world. And part of the reason for this is because of the many different kinds of fire that exist, which is a weird thought because when one thinks of fire, you usually only think of flames and that's pretty much it. But there are, in fact, different classifications of fire. And my goal today is to give you an understanding of the science behind the combustion process by explaining these classifications of fire and the best method of extinguishment for each individual one. Now, the 3D Firefighting Safety Bulletin states that a fire can double in size in roughly 60 seconds, which is extraordinarily fast. So it's important that you know what kind of fire you're dealing with and how to stop it quickly before it becomes uncontrollable. Now, me personally, I'm currently finishing up my associate's degree in fire technology, and I've been involved in the fire service since I was about 15 years old when I first joined my local Fire Explorer program. And one of my absolute favorite things to do as an explorer was to be involved in pub ed or public education. And part of the reason for this is because in 2014, my cousin's family's house caught fire while they were sleeping, and they literally became homeless overnight because they were such a big family. They're a family of 5. It was hard for them to find a consistent place to stay, which was a difficult time for them. And so having known these hazard abatements and having known what kind of fire they were dealing with could have or may have saved them a lot of hurt, which is why I think everybody in the community should be involved in fire prevention through public education, through their local fire department. But in order to stop a fire safely and effectively, it's imperative to have an understanding of what the combustion process is, like I said, and what the classifications of fire are, as well as the type of fire extinguisher that will extinguish that classification of fire that you're dealing with. But first on our list is understanding the science behind the combustion process. Now, Raymond Friedman and Richard Gahn, who are co-authors of the book Principles of Fire Behavior and Combustion, define combustion as a chemical chain reaction, and this reaction is what causes things to catch fire. But this chemical chain reaction can be defined in layman's terms as the release of energy in the form of heat and light. See light, feel heat, right? That's fire. But there must be a perfect mixture of 3 things in order for combustion to occur. That's known as the fire triangle. Oxygen, heat, and fuel. And when those 3 things come together to create that chemical chain reaction, that then becomes the fire tetrahedron. But according to Trilok Sai Panchal, who is a member of the Institution of Fire Engineers, states that if one of these ingredients are removed, then combustion cannot and will not occur. However, combustion can occur in more ways than one. There are actually 5 classifications of fire that are separated in alphabetical order, which is kind of helpful. J. Craig Volkert, who is a vice president of sales and special hazards at the Amerex Corporation, who actually manufactures fire extinguishers, describes these classifications of fire in his article Fire and Fire Extinguishers. And he states that Class A fires, starting off with the first one, Class A fires involve ordinary combustibles, things that are commonplace in a household, such as wood, paper, and cloth. We call them room and contents fires. And the Fire Equipment Manufacturers Association states that the preferred method of extinguishment for Class A fires is good old-fashioned water. But that is not the only method of extinguishment for this classification. Which is weird because when you think of firefighters, you think of fire trucks that carry 500 plus gallons of water, but that's not the only method of extinguishment for fire. The other extinguishing agents, such as halogenated agents and foam, will smother the flames or will smother the fire and extinguish the flames just as effectively as water. Now, moving on to Class B fires. Class B fires involve flammable liquids, obviously such as gasoline, which is the first one that comes to mind. But in this scenario, water will actually make the situation worse because gasoline and water don't mix. And so if you try putting out a Class B fire with water, you're just going to be pushing that substance and the fire will be sitting on top. So you're effectively spreading the fire. So obviously water is not a preferred method of extinguishment at all for Class B fires. According to the Fire Equipment Manufacturers Association, dry chemical and wet chemical fire extinguishers are best suited for putting these kinds of fires out because they use a powdery substance and are thus highly recommended. Well, actually, they'll smother the fire, and that's why they're highly recommended for extinguishment of Class B fires, because they will break that chain reaction. Moving on to Class C fires. Class C fires involve live electrical equipment, and because water is an excellent conductor of electricity, obviously it's not a recommended method of extinguishment for Class C fires. Instead, the Fire Equipment Manufacturers Association make it clear that instead dry chemical, wet chemical, and halogenated agents, especially carbon dioxide, are most effective against Class C fires. Moving on to Class D fires, Class D fires involve combustible metals, which is a little different, such as titanium and magnesium. But combustible metals are tricky because adding water to them will make the flames intensify. So water should not be used on Class D fires. The only extinguishing agent that is effective or that will effectively put out a Class D fire is dry powder, which is a little different than dry chemical. And interestingly, the Fire Equipment Manufacturers Association notes that dry powder extinguishers are actually ineffective on all other classes of fire. So Class D extinguishers are exclusively for Class D fires. Now, granted, it's highly unlikely that you will ever be faced with a Class D fire, but it's still important information to know. Now, moving on to the final class is Class K fires, and it kind of skips a couple letters. I don't know why that is. That's just the way that it happens to be. But Class K fires involve flammable cooking materials such as animal fats or vegetable oils. And you may have heard the saying, never put water on a grease fire. And it's a common saying for good reason, because adding water to grease fires or these kinds of fires will cause an explosive reaction. And so therefore, the Fire Equipment Manufacturers Association states that wet chemical extinguishers are actually best suited for use against Class K fires. Now, each classification of fire previously mentioned will burn at a different rate of spread and at a different rate of intensity. So like I said, it's important that you know which one you're dealing with so that you can act quickly. And this may be a lot of information to digest just from hearing me talk about it for 8 minutes, but there are other credible sources or outlets that you can use to become an expert yourself. Because this is just a very brief overview of the combustion process, as well as the classifications of fire and their methods of extinguishment. But fire is unpredictable, and the world of fire protection and prevention is expansive. So I suggest that all of you do your own research to further inform yourselves of these hazard abatements through research, even watching videos, and through your local fire department, through public education programs that they offer. And if you still are wondering how this applies to you, well, seconds can mean the difference between life and death. So don't become a statistic.